Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We've got over 200 people on this webinar, and it's going up by the second. I'm watching the ticker thing go up, so I missed my cue to start talking. So, a very warm welcome from me. Before we get into today's conversation, I just want to tell you a little bit about women in prison, just very, very briefly, for those of you who don't know us. So we were established in 1983 by a former prisoner called Chris Tchaikovsky, who was very inspired by her own experiences to set us up. And for more than 40 years, we've been working directly in prisons, through the gate, and in the community. We provide expert holistic support on everything from housing to domestic abuse to finance, supporting women to get back on their feet after contact with the criminal justice system. Last year, we supported an incredible 4,000 women directly, as well as campaigning for systemic change to end the harms that imprisonment and criminalisation create to women, their children, and their communities. Vicky Price, who you probably can see at the top of the screen, is today's host. She's an acclaimed economist and author, as well as the chair of Women in Prison's Leadership Board, a collective of dedicated experts, advisors, and change makers committed to driving systemic change for women affected by the criminal justice system. Vicky also sits on our board of trustees and is wonderful support to the organisation. My only job now is to give you some housekeeping updates before I hand over. So first of all, just to let you all know that the session is being recorded. You can turn on auto subtitles if you wish to. We're really pleased that we've got some women with lived experience talking to us today. They're not reading their own stories, but they're reading stories on behalf of women who are currently in prison. Just a bit of a trigger warning, we might touch on some sensitive topics relating to criminal justice and personal experiences such as domestic abuse or homelessness and addiction. We invite and encourage you to ask questions today. Just pop them in the chat, and my colleague is, you can see on the screen, Imogen, is collecting them, and we'll be pausing a little bit later to address some of the questions. Please do keep them respectful and relevant to the conversation and to the speakers, because we now have like over 220 people on the call. We won't get to all the questions, but we will do as much as we can to collate them for you. That's me done. I'm going to hand over to Vicky to welcome you and introduce herself and today's speakers.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you everyone for joining. So welcome. As you heard, I'm Vicky Price. I'm an economist. I've written a book called Prisonomics. I'm also the chair of Women in Prison's Leadership Board and also trustee of the charity. Today's meeting is all about understanding the realities behind women's involvement in the justice system and, of course, the challenges that they face. And my hope and our hope from all of us is that you leave here more informed, hopefully inspired and motivated to support the work which we all here do, and particularly all the people who you can probably see on the screen and loads more behind on a daily basis. We have some speakers, so we're going to have a discussion of the issues, and then we're going to be opening it up to possibly taking in some of your questions, and hope you can then later on follow on with understanding, perhaps after you've understood a bit better what this is all about, with some support for the organization itself. Today's speakers are Kate Fraser. Kate is Women in Prison's Head of Practice. We have Lucy Russell, Women in Prison's Head of Policy and External Affairs, and Natasha Anantala from Women in Prison's Women and for Change Lived Experience Group, who are also going to participate in the discussion, which I think you'll find really interesting. They will all be sharing their expertise and insights today. We also have Kate, Isabel, and Imogen. Again, you can see them there on the screen from the development team, who are monitoring the chat and making sure that everything goes smoothly behind the scenes. Really indebted to them. So Kate will now introduce some of the many challenges, as I said, that women in the criminal justice system face, and help set the scene for today's discussion. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, Vicky. The criminal justice system is broken. Women and girls often end up in prison or the justice system because of poverty, trauma, and abuse. Women are often criminalised for survival-linked offences such as theft, including shoplifting food, toiletries, baby items, self-defence, or being coerced into carrying drugs or committing fraud. There are around about 3,400 women currently in prison, and strikingly, around 63% are there for non-violent offences. Almost half of women in prison today are serving short sentences of 6 months or less. This uproots lives. Even short prison sentences can lead to women losing their homes, jobs, and custody of their children. After release, problems don't just simply disappear. Women face unstable housing or homelessness, deepening poverty, stigma, trauma, and social exclusion. Prison is not the answer, nor is it a safe place for women. But to really understand what it means to be a woman caught up in the criminal justice system, we really have to listen to women's voices. The stories that you're about to hear are drawn from conversations with women in prison. They are their words, their experiences, and their realities. Like so many women in prison, they can't be here today to tell those stories themselves. Natasha and Antella are both members of Women in Prison's Women for Change Lived Experience group. They each bring their own lived experience of the criminal justice system, but today they're doing something incredibly important. They're lending their voices to amplify the experiences of other women, women whose stories deserve to be heard, even if they can't tell them themselves. So whilst these are individual testimonies, they speak to experiences that are shared by so many women across our prisons, experiences of trauma, poverty, abuse, survival, loss, and most importantly, of resilience. As you listen, I invite you not to hear these as exceptional stories, but as a reflection of a system that too often responds to women's experiences with punishment instead of support. I'm now going to hand over to Natasha and Antella.
I didn't wake up one morning and decide to assault an officer. By the time they came to my house that night, I'd spent nearly 15 years learning how to survive, learning how to read the look on his face before he spoke, learning which version of dinner wouldn't get thrown across the room, learning how to hide bruises with makeup and tell the children, Dad's just tired. When you've lived like that for long enough, fear becomes normal. People always ask why women don't leave. I tried. I rang a helpline once from work. I was told I need to leave before anyone could actually help me. Leave? And go where? The tenancy was in his name. The bank account was in his name. The money was his. So I started hiding little bits of cash instead. £2 here, £5 there. Then I gave it to a friend to keep because if he found it, he'd want to know who I was leaving him for. I called the police more than once. Sometimes I called, sometimes the neighbours called. Every time I hoped this would be the time somebody really saw what was happening. And every time they left and I stayed. This night was different. He'd strangled me. It wasn't the first time, but I remember thinking, he's actually going to kill me. When the police arrived, he was calm. He always was. He told them that I'd been drinking, that I was hysterical, and that I made stuff up. I was crying. I was shaking, and I couldn't get my words out. I just needed somebody to understand how frightened I was. Instead, people were talking over me. An ambulance crew arrived, and someone told me to calm down. Another reached to move me out of the way while they continued to talk to him. Something in me just snapped. Years of fear, Years of surviving, years of believing that even when I asked for help, nobody would help me. I lashed out, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I was terrified. And that was the moment that everything changed. When I got to prison, I thought I'd be the only one. Then, one evening, another woman asked what I was in for. So I told her. She looked at me and she quietly said, mine started with him too. Then another woman joined in. Her story started with an abusive partner. Then another and another. One had gone to jail for shoplifting after fleeing domestic violence with nothing. One had supplied drugs because she'd been coerced by her partner. One had stabbed her husband after years of violence and control. Different offences, the same beginning. That's when I realised women in prison weren't just bad people. Prison was full of women whose stories had started long before the offence on the charge sheet.
Thanks, Natasha. If we could have the next slide, please. We are now going to hear from Antella.
People think that crisis happens all at once, but mine didn't. Mine happened slowly, over time. So slow that I couldn't even see it myself. And so slow that by the time people noticed, all they could see was the explosion, not the years that were leading up to it. I'm a Black British woman, and for as long as I can remember, I felt like people saw my strength before they saw my struggle. If I was upset, I was dramatic. If I was frustrated, I was aggressive. If I stood up for myself, I was intimidated. And now I know, because I've educated myself about all of this, that I was being labelled as that woman, the angry Black woman. I've lost count of how many times I've felt this label sitting in the room before I'd even opened my mouth. The truth was, I wasn't angry. I was exhausted and frightened, and most important, I was becoming more and more unwell. I went to my GP, then I went back again and again. I told them I couldn't sleep. I told them that my head was all over the place and that my thoughts were jumping like beans. I told them that I felt overwhelmed all the time and that I was scared of where my mind was taking me. They gave me numbers to call and forms to fill in, and I'd sit on waiting lists waiting for help. I needed help, but nobody actually helped me. Months passed, then nearly 3 years, and I knew I had stopped looking after myself. I'd stopped answering the phone. All my friends drifted away because I didn't have the energy to explain what was happening. I felt invisible. Then that night, everything crashed when I turned up in A&E. I told them I wasn't coping and that I didn't feel safe. After waiting hours, I sat through an assessment and then they sent me home. Nothing had changed. I was still scared and unwell and alone. I remember sitting in my house afterwards thinking, what exactly do I have to do before somebody believes me? I stayed up all night and I rang the GP as soon as I could at 8 o'clock to get that appointment that I was desperate for. My head had gone, but I wasn't angry. I was desperate. I begged for an appointment. I told them I couldn't carry on like this. I begged them for help. And when they told me that there was nothing available, something inside me broke. And I said, if nobody helped me that day, I'd come down there and kill somebody. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I've never been violent in my life. I had no intention of hurting anybody. What I was trying to say was, I cannot do this anymore and I need help. But that's not what people heard. What they heard was a threat. And that threat became my first prison sentence. Threats to kill. That's what it says on the paperwork. It doesn't say that I spent years knocking on doors crying out for help, asking for help and trying to tell people I was getting worse. It doesn't say that by the time I had entered the courtroom, I'd already been punished over and over again because I was begging for help and it never happened. When I stood in court, people talked about risk and public protection. Nobody talked about how I'd reached this desperate place. Nobody talked about mental health support. And nobody talked about how easy it was for a black woman on her knees to be seen as threatening before she's seen as vulnerable. I always say now that my crime wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of it. The last chapter in years of asking for help and wondering why nobody was listening.
Thanks, Antella. I'm going to be reading for Lucy today. If we could have the next slide, please. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today. I know that when people hear the word homeless, they picture somebody sleeping in a doorway. But that's not how it started for me. I had a home, a 3-bedroom house with a knackered washing machine that made a funny noise when it spun. I had a kitchen table that was covered in school letters and half-finished homework and bills, always bills. I had a front door that my kids ran through every day. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then I got a prison sentence. Not years, not even months and months, but just long enough to lose everything. The rent wasn't paid, so they ended the tenancy on me. The bills piled up. People knew I wasn't there and broke in, and the furniture went, and what didn't go was wrecked. Worst of all, the kids' things went, and by the time I came out, the place where our lives had happened just didn't exist anymore. I thought that once I walked out of those prison gates, the sentence had ended, but the truth is, that's when the problems really started, because I didn't have a home to go to. I didn't have a key for a front door, and I didn't have a bed. I didn't have an address. What I did have was a bin bag and a list of phone numbers. I remember sitting in the housing office explaining that I'd been in prison and needed somewhere to live, and being told that because I'd lost my house while I was inside, there wasn't anything they could do. They said that I had made myself homeless. I wanted to scream. How could people think I chose this? That I chose prison? The charge was for supplying drugs, and I was guilty. I'm not standing here pretending otherwise. But the charge didn't say that the drugs belonged to him. It didn't say that by then I was terrified of him, that every time I tried to say no, there was a consequence waiting for me when I got home. The charge didn't say that he controlled the money or who I saw and everything that happened in that house. Everybody agreed I supplied drugs, but nobody asked why a woman with no history of violence, no history of drug dealing, suddenly found herself standing in a courtroom looking at a prison sentence. So, when they told me I'd made myself homeless because I went to prison, all I could think was, at what point was any of this really a choice? I wanted to scream. How was I supposed to keep my home from a prison cell? How do you think I could stop myself becoming homeless when I was locked up? But that's the thing about homelessness, you know. People treat it like a personal failure, like it only happens because you've made bad decisions. They told me I was lucky to be offered temporary accommodation. I got a mixed hostel that was full of men I didn't know and doors that didn't lock properly. The kids couldn't visit because people were using drugs in the corridor, and you could hear the women crying through the walls at night, just like jail. I'd spent years being scared of a man, and now I was expected to recover from that in a place where I never felt safe. The council called it temporary accommodation, but I called it survival. And the hardest part wasn't even that. The hardest part was my kids, because once you've lost your home, you start losing other things too. They couldn't stay overnight, and so I couldn't show social services that I had somewhere that was suitable for them. I couldn't give them their own beds in their own rooms in their own home. So every time they left after a visit, I watched them walk away, carrying bits of my heart with them. People ask why housing matters. And I would say that housing matters because it isn't just a roof over your head. It's safety, dignity, stability. It's where my kids come home to from school, and it's where I could start to feel safe. It's where people begin again. When I lost my home, I didn't just lose a building. I lost who I was and my place in the world. You know, when somebody finally helped me find a safe place to live, something mad happened, because the first time in years, I stopped thinking about where I was going to sleep and I started thinking about how I wanted to live, actually making plans, yeah? Because that's what a home gives you. It's not just somewhere to stay, a future. Thank you so much. The statistics shared help us understand the scale of the issue, but numbers can only ever tell us so much. I want to tell you about what women in prison are doing to help. Over the last year, we've reached 4,000 women, offering them the confidence and support that enable those women to rebuild their lives on their own terms. 96% of women we helped have experienced positive changes. As you've heard, nearly 70% of women in prison have experienced domestic abuse. We've launched a domestic abuse specialist support programme, co-produced with women with lived experience, helping 200 women in the community this year. Next slide, please. In the past year, when accessing our services, 76% of women reported improved mental health and well-being. Next slide, please. We launched a new housing service this year, supporting nearly 200 women with specific in-depth housing support. And 81% of women are making gains in securing stable accommodation. Importantly, what I really want to emphasise is that we support women without restrictions, whatever their circumstances. Some services in the sector might only be able to engage with women after a certain set of conditions are met. For example, domestic abuse services are often not able to work with a woman with a criminal record, or if they are still with their abusive partner. I think, Vicky, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we're now going to move to talk about sort of why we need a system change to happen. So we got slides, I think, coming up for that. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to read you some more words from a woman who has been in prison. Sue describes her time in prison as, for 23 hours, you are locked up in a tomb-like cell. You can hear women shriek, tear their clothes, and smash all the windows. It's cold, it's damp, there's a poor diet, and it feels bad for the body, for the mind, and it feels inhuman and demoralizing. I've taken slight artistic interpretation with these words because they're the words of Susan Willis Fletcher, who was in Westminster Prison in the 1880s. And that's what's really frightening and really concerning, is how little things have changed for women since that time. So, for example, in the kind of 1850s to 1870s, 70 women were removed from prison and placed in what was then at the time called lunatic asylums. In the 1860s, a journalist called Frederick Robinson published a series of articles talking about what was happening to women, which included self-harm in prison. Only it wasn't categorized as that. It was categorized as bad behavior or poor activities, never really recognizing what prison actually did to women. So here we are, over 150 years later, and we're still looking at imprisoning women because of poor mental health, because of the effects of poverty, because they're trying to survive and respond to domestic abuse, and because they're just trying to survive life and what life throws at them. 20 years ago, there was a report called the Corsten Report, and it started to really demonstrate the nuances of what we know about women in prison. It showed that women in prison and in the criminal justice system had very complex needs. It identified how violence, abuse, sexual exploitation, poverty, mental health, and substance misuse were all key factors in women's criminalisation, and that the way the system treats women has to change, but the change of pace has been slow. Despite that, women in prison have been around for over 40 years, and we have been making a difference for women. Some of our campaign successes in the past have included we submitted over 200 case studies as evidence of inadequate healthcare and the failings of a dangerous prison medical service until it was finally replaced in 2006. And now the NHS commissions health services in prisons. We worked to close Durham H Wing in 2005. That was a prison that was deemed unfit for men, and they closed it and then put women in it. And more recently, we campaigned for an end to putting girls, so that's teenage girls, young women, into youth offending institutions. Those girls were experiencing strip searching, they were experiencing mental health crisis, and we've been able to change that with our partners. Based on our work, the government has committed to better training for prison officers so that they can actually meet the needs of women. And very recently, over 100 organisations joined up with us to sign a letter calling for better policies in prisons, in the criminal justice system, for survivors of domestic abuse. So right now we're at a tipping point for change. The government wants to see fewer women in prison. The Sentencing Act has changed how sentences will impact women. And if it works, we might see women getting more support as part of their sentences. The government has also announced new intensive supervision courts across England, and these should include specialist support for women and look at the root causes of women's offending and how we support them, not punish them. But survivors of domestic abuse are still being criminalised, and mentally ill women are still in prison. Poverty, homelessness, and substance misuse are still drivers of criminalisation. And that's why we need systems change. That's why we need to campaign. We need to look at policies, laws, and structures and put the pressure on to make that change. So as Kate mentioned, we're speaking up for the women who are often treated as invisible. They're the women who, for want of a better phrase, fall through the cracks in the services. We're with women where other services are not helping or even sometimes not seeing them. When the women are facing trauma and crisis, whether that's in police cells, in prisons, and on probation, that's where we are. In the next few years, this is what we want to achieve, and it is ambitious, but systems change has to be ambitious, and we cannot have any more years of this problem still happening. So we want to see fewer women in prison. We want to reduce the numbers of domestic abuse survivors who are sentenced to prison, and we want a better understanding of how domestic abuse leads to criminalisation and an improved justice system because of that. We want better domestic abuse support in prisons, and we want fewer women being put on remand. So that means being sent to prison before you've been given a sentence. We want to see fewer mentally ill women sent to prison and instead for them to get healthcare. We want to see better healthcare in prisons all round. And we want to see housing policies that actually meet the needs of women in the criminal justice system. To do this work, We need the loudest voice we can possibly have. And that's where we really need people like you who are attending this webinar to support us and to amplify that message, because the only way we're going to make change is if we're doing it together. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. That was very insightful, and thank you everyone who's contributed so far. But I wanted to remind everybody that what we are thinking about right now is how to amplify everything that we just heard to make sure that we do get change now, and why change is so important. It is a very crucial moment. Of course, we have to realize and accept that women form a very small part of the prison population, but they're a very important part. When I look at it as an economist, it's really very worrying, because the impact on their children and on the wider community is completely disproportionate to their numbers in prison. And so prison harms women, their children, and the community and the economy, because it basically deprives the community and the economy of their work, their contribution to society, and more importantly, even if it is a very small prison sentence, their children. And we do have a lot of evidence, as we just heard a little bit from the testimonials that were read earlier, that children of women who go to prison tend to not stay in their homes, whereas if a man goes to prison, the likelihood is that the children will stay in their homes. If a woman goes to prison, 9 out of 10 children move, only 1 stays on average, and that is pretty horrific for the children's well-being and for what happens later. They lose out on education, they lose out on social behaviors. They are the ones who are more likely to end up being in the care of social services. That costs a huge amount to the economy and to the public purse. And then, of course, they're also much more likely to end up in the criminal justice system themselves. And that is really why we're looking at alternatives, and we may want to discuss them in the brief period that we have left still this afternoon. There is, of course, a greater shift right now towards community-based, trauma-informed support as a proven alternative that works far better. And we, of course, also are very involved with women's centres, which we hope to will make an even bigger difference in the future. And I know from looking at the chat, and a number of people are mentioning the support that is given for women who come out of prison. We talked about not having a home, not having the ability to start a new life. And of course, you know, the support, the psychological support that needs to be given. But just on the basic cost to the economy, it costs £52,000 roughly to put one woman in prison for a year. Of course, it also costs a lot to put a man in prison, but as we said earlier, it excludes all the additional indirect costs, such as children entering care that I mentioned, lost housing, lost economic output, etc. Whereas specialist community support costs around £2,000 per woman, which is really just a fraction of the cost for of putting people in prison. Now, of course, we are likely to be having a change of government. We have been very, very involved in advocacy to ensure that things change, involved in every sort of committee that exists to change the system. Sonia is working incredibly hard on this, and all the people in our who are trustees and also on the leadership board do the same, helping to change the environment. But this is a really important opportunity that we have. There is a rethink already. If we can actually make the rethink go even further, I think that would make a huge difference. So first of all, to thank you for listening and hopefully also for continued support. But I wanted to open it up, just have for the next few minutes, perhaps a look at what is in the chat and see what it has been raised and asked. And I think one of the questions, of course, which is coming up again, is if we can discuss the alternatives a little bit better. Sorry, the better alternatives a bit further, and how we see them shaping up in the future. And I was wondering whether sort of Kate can think of how to address that question. Kate?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Yeah, I think there are a number of alternatives to prison that we could look at. And I think the first thing that we have to consider is that we should be designing those with women who've who have experienced the criminal justice system. So co-produced services designed and delivered by women who've had experience of that and who know what it's like. So we understand there are lots of services out there that are run by statutory sector organisations, but actually we feel that the women best placed to design those services, women who've experienced it. I would say definitely, as Vicky talked about, women's centres, lots of names popping up here today. I know Joy from Anna Wim's here today, somebody's here from Together Women. So those women's centres that play a vital role in supporting women, particularly women on probation, where women can go to those women's centres. And really, for most of those centres, that the criteria is really initially just that you're a woman and that you can turn up and you can get holistic, trauma-informed relational support, holistic support. I think also looking at diversion services, so looking at services that are really catching women before they get caught up or too entrenched in the criminal justice system. So looking at out of court resolutions, looking at diversionary schemes that run from police custody suites, everything that we can do to stop people getting caught up in the criminal justice system.
Yes, well, there is of course a question which says, what would you change with the criminal justice system itself? So one of the questions that's come out in the chat, and I mean the interesting thing is that yes, we have had a new look at sort of reducing, short or not imposing short custodial sentences. Do you think that's going to work and be positive in the end, or are we perhaps going to have the danger of things being, in fact, becoming sentences which are longer, or the support that needs to be given to women during those non-custodial sentences that may be given, like, instead, they may not get enough either supervision, or they may be too restrictive and not exactly help women to reestablish their lives. I think we've got to sort of balance it out and see what do we think might be the result of this. It's going to be good for women or not in the end.
I think I can talk from an operational point of view, and then Lucy might want to come in from a policy standpoint on that. I think, there is this idea that if you go to prison, you will get the help that you need. And whilst there are some really good pockets of good work being delivered in prisons, often by organisations in the third sector, charitable organisations who are able to provide that trauma-informed relational support, by and large, still need. So women are still coming out of prison homeless. They're still coming out. If you had poor mental health when you went in, chances are your mental health is still going to be poor when you out. If you had debt, your debt will probably have increased. If you had a house, chances are that you will have lost that house, your children, your job, your self-esteem. And all of those things are still happening, and those are happening for women at longer sentences, but with shorter sentences as well. So this idea, I want to kind of dispel that myth that going to prison you'll get the help that you need, because that just doesn't happen. I don't know, Lucy, do you want to come in with something on policy side around ending short sentences?
I absolutely agree with you, Kate, that is a key part of chunks of the policy thinking, is that you'll get the help you need. So one of the things that has changed is that if you don't follow your kind of probation rules, then you could get recalled to prison. And that period of time has now been made to be much longer, and a set period of time for everybody, again, based on this presumption that you'll get what you need. But as we heard from the stories of the women today, actually what you do is lose contact with your children, lose your tenancy, lose your house, lose your job. And so the kind of the reality and the policy just aren't matching up. But yeah, with the new Sentencing Act, what we're looking at is kind of suspended sentences with what should be support in place for women. This does have the potential to make a real impact and to do something really interesting. But we're also looking at a women's sector that has not had really robust, sustainable funding for a long time. And we're looking at the women who keep falling through all the different gaps in the services. So I've noticed lots of people in the chat have been saying, I'm trying to find housing for a woman I'm working with, but they're rejecting her because of her offence. We also know how hard it can be to get housing and work, and that services, for substance misuse, for alcohol interventions, for mental health, are not always joined up. And quite often women are sent to these services and they're, designed generically, which actually means they're designed for men, and they don't understand the trauma that women have been through. They don't understand women's gender specific needs. So this is the big question for the next few years. We've got a complete change in law, we've got a change in how the sentences work, but we need a really significant change in the services that support women. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to fulfill the changes in expectations of their suspended sentence, and then we'll find them going back to short sentences in prison. So time will tell. Proof is in the pudding, I think, but we do have a really tricky situation where the government has got to invest in the alternatives to prison for this to work and to actually address the root causes of what's happening in women's lives.
Yes, well, I mean, there are other things also in the chat about the probation service and how it works, and I think that would be an interesting one to touch on and see whether, of course, they've had their ups and downs and what we think of that. But there is also, there was quite a lot said in the testimonials, if you like, about the abuse that women also suffer at home, which then leads to them becoming, embroiled in the criminal justice system, whichever way it ends, and the fact that there is now a new and tougher sort of sentence given for people who attack emergency workers, which I presume include the police. So do we have a view on that and how it might affect it? Because if that is rolled out in a serious way, then quite a lot of the women, like the ones we heard about in the testimonials, will find themselves into the criminal justice system much more easily than perhaps was the case before. Is that a concern we have?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the testimonial we heard, that example of a woman feeling just one thing after another, all building up into her and then just lashing out for 1 second. And in that second, she's committed an offence that's technically called assault against an emergency worker. And what we have found is that this offence, which is only a few years old, is significantly disproportionately drawing women into the criminal justice system. And when we talk to the women who've been drawn in, and we are seeing a lot of women coming to our support services with this offence, they have been in a violent and abusive situation where they've been looking for help, they've been in a fight or flight panic situation, or they are neurodiverse or having a mental health crisis, and their reaction is based very much on their trauma or their neurodiversity processing. And so that offence is a huge concern for us. But also, Vicky, you picked up on the issue of domestic abuse, and really sadly we work with so many women who have been criminalised because of the coercion and the abuse that they've experienced. We have some more research coming, so we'll definitely be in touch with everyone here about that, because it is such a concerning situation, and a situation that the criminal justice system is not responding to at the moment.
Vicky, can I just jump in there as well, actually, because I think there is also this idea that or a misunderstanding that domestic abuse stops when a woman goes to prison. And actually, what we've discovered is that really nearly a quarter of women, I think, that we spoke to across different prisons said that domestic abuse continued even while they were in custody, with partners using access to children, access to finances, or threats around access to accommodation on release. So those women are still experiencing that abuse whilst they're in custody, with limited support services. Lots of those support services are often delivered by third sector organisations, often women's centres delivering those services within prisons. But it doesn't stop when women come to prison.
And thank you. And I did raise the issue of probation, because there was a question which actually said that during the period they were looked after by the probation services, it was fine, but then there was nothing. So a lot of the problems that they had were still there, which I presume is where women in prison come in and other services. And I've seen quite a lot of people suggesting that various services that are involved with, which can perhaps add to whatever exists out there to support the women in a longer term perspective rather than just the short period during which they may be on probation.
I think Natasha might want to answer this, because I know she has spoken before at length about her experiences of support that she received from probation services as opposed to support that she received from women in prison. Natasha, do you want to say a couple of words?
Well, when I went to probation, they were really overstretched. They were really overrun. I had a good rapport with my probation worker, but anything that I highlighted with her. So, my mum's got brain damage. My mum's currently upstairs. We've got a hearing at Court of Protection tomorrow. My mum came with me to every single probation meeting because there was no one else to, support with my mum. So my mum was in the room, which is not really supposed to happen. A lot of my meetings were taken up asking me about my mum rather than myself. And anything that I did highlight that I required support with, literally, I just got referred to women in prison. And I was told, go to women in prison, go to women in prison. Okay, well, maybe you should try and discuss this with women in prison. And I was referred to women in prison, and I was a service user, and I did attend the hubs, and it completely transformed the whole trajectory of my life. My life is completely different today, and I owe a lot of that to women in prison, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But probation was completely overstretched, and anything that I did bring to them, I was just referred back to women in prison. Thank you.
Gosh, I mean, it's good that women in prison at least is considered to be, the place to go, if you like. But of course, if they don't provide the other services that they're meant to provide, then that is a real problem, as we are well aware. And there are quite a lot of people in the chat who are highlighting various services that they know of or they provide. And I think that would be very, very useful in terms of, working more closely with yourselves, by which I mean the people in the chat who are putting all these names and also the services down. So I think we will capture all that, and I think that would be really, really interesting. I mean, there is also a question in terms of sort of what amendments or changes to the law would we want, therefore. There is a real concern that every time one suggests that women should be looked at differently because they are victims rather than being offenders, then there is the reaction that we shouldn't be treating people differently, in front of the law. But what would you recommend more generally in terms of, what changes would we really like to see? Kate, perhaps, and Lucy, and anyone else from the panel.
Do you want to go, Lucy?
Okay, and then everybody can pick up bits that I've missed. So we want to see a kind of an overarching commitment to fewer women in prison. The government has said they want that too, and the ministers of justice have committed to that. They formed a women's justice board, which was a group of experts which advised the government on how this could be done, and that set out some recommendations. And certainly we really want to see that to take action and to get moving. There's got to be investment, and there's got to be a real drive for change. And Vicky, you mentioned earlier, we're going to see quite a significant change in government over the next couple of months. We're going to see complete cabinet reshuffle. And so we really want to make sure that whoever is in positions of power continues that commitment to reducing women in prison. What we've learned around domestic abuse is that you cannot say it's one particular offence. It drives women to offending across every different type of offence. And so, although we do want a better legal defence around being coerced and forced into offending, we would really like to see a presumption right at the beginning that the police, that the liaison and diversion in police custody suites, that people who are the first people you come into contact with have a presumption that they don't want to arrest survivors of domestic abuse and they don't want to criminalise them. And that's what the really big picture needs to look like, because we cannot legislate on every single offence about domestic abuse. We need a much bigger picture that if a woman is experiencing abuse, should she really be criminalised in the first place? And that's a real kind of shift and a change, but that's what needs to happen. And we need that commitment to seeing women who might be victims, survivors of domestic abuse, and may also be committing an offence, and make sure that the criminal justice system starts to understand that you can be both and that you should still be treated as someone who is surviving domestic abuse. We really need to see an end to remand. We are seeing women being put into prison who have not been sentenced. And this is very disproportionate for Black, racially minoritized and migrant women. It is terrifying, traumatic experience. And that's something that really needs to change very, very rapidly. A large proportion of women who are on remand go on to not receive a sentence. And so there's a real injustice happening there, and something in the system is quite broken. We need a shift around imprisoning and arresting mentally ill women. There has been some really good changes in the law, but that law needs to turn into practice. And really fundamentally, that means that the services that support mentally unwell people need investment, need support, need building up. And then we need housing policies that are gender aware. At the moment, the gender sensitivity of housing and homelessness policies are really weak. They have such huge gaps in them. That needs to change, and they need to understand what women are going through. And then we need to support women into safe, appropriate accommodation. The number of women we work with who are told, oh, you're allowed into one approved premise, so that's where you're allowed to go and move into after prison. You're going to go in with a lot of men who've also left prison, who've committed violent offences against women. This is going to be your home. Who would stay there? We wouldn't stay there. Why are women being expected to do that? There's a real lack of gender sensitivity across housing policies, and that's got to shift. And that's certainly something we'll be focusing on as well. I'll let other people jump in now before I talk too much.
I only wanted to say that actually quite a lot of what you said is supported by some of the issues that I've raised in the chat. But also, there is, just thinking about women, there was also the recommendation in the chat, which I think we'd agree with entirely, that the pre-sentence reports need to be looked at quite carefully by whoever makes any decisions about women, and that isn't done sufficiently. And that's one of the things that we should be pushing. There is also in the chat the defense of the service that actually sort of the probation service, which looks after women, but they do accept that they're overstretched. So there was a note from someone in the Midlands saying that this was a problem, but they are the people who work for it are dedicated to supporting women, and I think this is absolutely true. But the resources are stretched, and we all know this is an issue. The domestic abuse one is coming up again and again. And the criminalisation of domestic abuse victims coming up in the chat. So I think we are all agreed to what to do about women's and ensuring that they have the confidence that they need to resume their lives. If, of course, they are very restricted in terms of where they go and where they live, that's going to be a little bit difficult. But there is some training and perhaps support that can be given. And as many of you know, I'm also involved with Working Chance, which helps women find jobs. Ex-offenders to find jobs as well after prison, which also requires them to get help to get over the concerns that they had about the possibility of ever finding a job again, and also their confidence. So there's a lot there, a huge amount of very helpful insights coming in the chat. They're also concerned, of course, that the perpetrators of abuse can then come out of, if they have been found guilty and are still there, often coming out during their sentences, of course, on license, and still bothering the women, and that doesn't seem to be going away as an issue. So we've got quite a lot of themes coming through, which women in prison are following anyway, but can perhaps work more closely with the people in the chat who perhaps we can all be in touch with later. So I think this is great. I'm probably going to have to be finishing soon, and I know that a number of people have to be going. So I just need some closing remarks. If I have not highlighted some of your chats, I mean, there were 250 of you sending loads of notes, which I think is it was absolutely brilliant, and we're going to take all that into account moving forward. And I know Sonia, as our CEO, will pursue quite a lot of that, and all the people who are in this chat today. I thank you very, very much for being with us today. I mean, just to say that women in prison do have the expertise and knowledge and the networks to drive, with your help, all the people who attended today and more, who weren't able to drive the necessary changes to limit the number of women and girls swept up into the criminal justice system, which is really what we all want. And you can help us strengthen our ability to achieve our goals, which would be really brilliant. It's one of the reasons for this. And the next steps, really, I mean, I've got to say that it would be great, since you expressed that already in the chat, to support what we're doing. And the team will be in touch with all of you with further updates and what we can do to work more closely together, and also how you can support us in achieving what we want to do. Some of that support, of course, needs to be financial. So please consider making a donation, those who can, today. But we will add the link. We've added the link, I think, to the chat for you. But we'll be in touch again with you all in terms of progress we're making, and to explore some of these things further. So I wanted to thank everybody, especially our wonderful speakers, Natasha and Angela, of course, and everyone else who contributed. And if I am not mistaken, we are finishing 1 minute early. But have I forgotten something? You guys tell me, please, or girls rather. Do tell me. But thank you. So with a bit of luck, as I said, we'll do a follow-up and talk to as many of you as we possibly can. And absolutely wonderful that we still have over 200 participants at the end of this. And this is really thanks to the contribution of all of you who've just spoken in this, and everyone who helped from behind the scenes. So thank you and goodbye.